Hey everyone, my name is Sara Harberson. I am America's college counselor. It's so good to see all of you here on another Facebook Live Q&A. So if you have college admissions questions, you can ask them and I'll try to answer as many as I possibly can. I'm really excited to be back here because we have admissions deadlines just around the corner. We've got some October 15th deadlines at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, and maybe a few more, but this is really going to get our cycle started. And so if you have questions about those applications, those supplements, or kind of that next round of deadlines, which is usually around November 1st, that's what I'm here for. But I know that we have high school seniors, juniors, sophomores, even freshmen that are joining us, and parents of those students, and even college counselors. So I'm really happy to be back here once again. I should mention that as always, I am streaming live on both of my Facebook pages, Sara Harberson and also Admissions Revolution. We also save all of these Facebook Lives for all of you, so you can go back and binge watch all the Facebook Lives that I have done over the last number of years. But I want to try to get to all those questions because this is always a busy Facebook Live, the October one. And again, that's because of those early deadlines that are approaching, but also a lot of students are getting into the groove of filling out applications, writing those essays, and I know they're gonna have a lot of questions. So why don't we get started? First question. Hi Sara, I'm considering applying early action to Georgetown. I took both the ACT and SAT. Can I submit the ACT score only? So Alex, Georgetown does their own thing. They always have done their own thing. They have their own application. They have a dean in place who's been there for a really long time. And so they have, historically speaking, been the most strict when it comes to what they want to see with test scores. In the past, they've been very explicit with their language that says that the student is required to report every last test. You really want to go onto the Georgetown website and take a look for yourself, but it seems like they're softening their language just a little bit. We'd have to go on the website just to see if they're asking for all scores, no question about it, no exceptions. My guess is, I think, just based on the number of times I've looked at it this year, is, again, they've softened a little bit. It looks like that ACT score is stronger than the SAT score, so my hope is that you only have to submit your ACT score. And really, Georgetown is the only one that has held on to this idea that students are going to be required to submit all SAT, ACT, subject tests, AP scores. Most of the colleges in this country will give the student a choice about which scores they report. And I always tell students, only report the scores that are going to strengthen your application. All right, next question. All right, hi Sara, joining you from Europe in the wee hours of the morning. Christine, you just made my night. I'm so happy you're joining us. I don't know what time of the early morning it is, but I know it's super, super early that you're tuning in. Thank you for joining us. My child took the ACT test last weekend, the last one available to us due to the November 1st deadline. The system experienced technical difficulties. There were problems with the test, a 2-hour delay, system kept stalling out, which reduced their time to complete the different sections. Needless to say, the resulting score was not what we thought. Her ACT score is at the bottom range of the accepted zone for the university she is applying, which has an acceptance rate of 16%. Will the school only see the composite individual test super scores, or will they also see all the scores from all the sections on both tests? I hope that makes sense. We're just on the fence as to whether or not she should include her test scores or not at this test optional school. After acceptance, you have to submit scores anyway. It kind of seems if you go test optional, there is something to hide. Okay, so it sounds like your daughter took the ACT twice and you are wondering how to report that. If your daughter is not happy at all with the scores that just came out, when she goes on the application, she can just provide those scores that she wants to share, maybe the scores from the first time that she took them. But I would say if both sets of ACT scores are in that bottom range of what the college typically admits in that middle 50% range for ACT scores, right there. This one. Yeah, sorry, we're just getting back into the technology. So if you look at that college's middle 50% range for the ACT scores of admitted students, and if your daughter's scores are lower than that, then yes, she absolutely can apply test optional. Here's the thing. If your daughter decides not to report any ACT scores or any SAT scores, it means that she's not disadvantaged, but it means that everything else in her application is going to weigh even more, especially that high school transcript. So if she has a really strong high school transcript in terms of not only grades, but her curriculum, I would say that might be a safer plan and option that she would have. Here's the thing with test optional colleges though. You don't have to submit test scores at all. You can wait until you've been admitted, and then obviously if you decide that you want to enroll at that institution, you would have to send an official score report to that college. That's just for records keeping. But those SAT or ACT scores would never factor into the admissions process if you're applying test optional. Next question. Hey, Christine, thank you so much for joining us here in the US. Next question. Are the University of California schools, except UC Merced, really a reach for everybody in state? It feels like that, right? Yeah, there are varying acceptance rates, and you will find that UCLA and UC Berkeley have the lowest acceptance rates. If you look at some of the other campuses, they become a little bit more reasonable. You might see some acceptance rates in the 20, 30, and 40% range. But you will find applying to the UC schools is going to be extremely competitive, not just for those out-of-state applicants, but for those in-state applicants as well. So just watch those acceptance rates. I always tell families when they're putting their college list together, look at the most recent year for admissions and look at the overall acceptance rate to make sure that you have a well-balanced list. Next question. I have a letter writer who has written me a 4-page letter, a recommendation. Should I tell them to shorten its length? Oh my gosh. So I'm trying to go back to when I was on the receiving end of these applications and these letters of recommendation. I would say that most letter writers are going to write a letter of recommendation that's going to be about a page, maybe a second page at the most. It would be really unusual for me to see a letter of recommendation that was 4 pages long. It's tough though. You know, a letter writer, your teacher, your college counselor, hopefully those are what you're focused on in terms of asking letter writers to write for you. They're doing you a favor. They don't get paid extra. And so giving them kind of restrictions or limitations might make them feel like, you know, they're being pressured to do something that they don't feel comfortable. I think honestly though, if you are applying to colleges that practice holistic admissions, that means that it's not just your test scores and grades, that an admissions officer is going to still look at that letter. What I can tell you is if I saw a 4-page letter of recommendation, I would very quickly go through that letter of recommendation looking for some key sentences and key paragraphs. But to expect admissions officers to read every single word in that letter of recommendation, I think would be unlikely. Next question. Hi, Jessie. How do colleges view students of multi-race? Are they counted into multi-categories or into a separate category? This is a really interesting question, and I think it's going to vary from college to college. I remember when I first started at the University of Pennsylvania in their undergraduate admissions office, we actually had a category that reflected what was listed on Common App or an application. So if a student indicated biracial, that's what would come up for the admissions officer. But since then, A lot of these colleges that have their own application, the common application, the coalition application, they really encourage students to list exactly what races make up who they are. So if I was looking at an application from a student who is half Asian American and half Black, for example, there would be an opportunity to list both of those races. So usually at this point, the admissions office is not going to just lump you into, multiracial. They want to know the breakdown of your ethnicity and your background. So almost always they're going to see all the check boxes that you mark off, whether you are Native American, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, you are going to be able to indicate that. And I think that is really a wonderful way if you're talking about holistic admissions, that's the way to really be able to see who that student is. And those applications allow the student to spell it out as well. Next question. If a college lists optional questions or resumes, should you always do them? Almost always, Gracie, you should do the optional questions. There are a few exceptions. So, for example, Duke University has a prompt about whether or not you identify as LGBTQ+. If you don't identify in one of those categories, you don't have to respond to that essay. There are also some of the bigger public universities providing a section that says, have you been negatively impacted by, something in your life, whether it was COVID or something else. Usually those are optional questions. So, but almost always in all the other circumstances, if the supplement or the college's application says that it's optional, I tell my students I want them to write that essay. You also asked about your resume. I would say that is not nearly as important as making sure that you fill out all the sections of your application. So it is rare to find a college that says you need to submit a resume. Almost always, the admissions officer really wants the student to use the template that's on the application, because it streamlines the process for the admissions officer, allows them to read that section of the application much faster. If they're looking at your activities list and then looking at a resume, there's going to be a lot of overlapping information. They don't have a lot of time to spend, so make sure you invest time in filling out the required sections of the application, like the activities list. You don't want to rely on just attaching a resume because a lot of admissions officers simply don't have time and would never open it. Next question. In order to be considered for merit-based aid scholarships, will parents need to submit the FAFSA and/or the CSS profile? So it's interesting. There's so much that's changing in the admissions and financial aid world. And over the last couple of years, Alex, we've seen a growing number of colleges and universities that are requiring the FAFSA and sometimes even the CSS profile just for a student who wants to be considered for merit scholarships. So even if that student is not applying for need-based aid, there are going to be some colleges out there that will require the FAFSA and possibly the CSS profile. You just have to look on the individual college websites to know. And if you don't see it on their admissions or financial aid website, pick up the phone, call, and ask. For the most part, though, the FAFSA and the CSS profile are financial aid forms that families need to fill out if they are requesting need-based financial aid. But again, as I mentioned, over the last couple of years, we've seen a growing number of colleges and universities requiring the FAFSA especially just to be considered for merit scholarships. If doing early decision, will admissions officers look at first quarter grades? Great question. So when an admissions officer is looking at an early decision application, for the most part, they are going to see your final grades as of junior year on the transcript or being reported in a self-reported section for courses and grades. They will see your senior year classes because that is a required section on all applications. But not all colleges are going to see your first quarter grades if you're applying early decision or early action. There are a handful of those institutions that do require first quarter grades for early decision and early action. There aren't many of them. I could probably count on one hand. University of Richmond, Wash U, Colgate are coming to mind, but that was at least last year. For the most part, though, you aren't going to be required to submit first quarter grades. However, I tell my Application Nation students every single year that if they do incredibly well first quarter of senior year and they're applying to a private university or a private college under early decision or early action, if their college counselor of record is willing to send those first quarter senior year grades along when they become available, it can absolutely strengthen a student's early decision or early action application. Those large public universities like UVA and University of Michigan, they don't want the first quarter grades. They can't handle the volume coming in. You know, University of Michigan received, I think, over 83,000 applications last year. I assume it will be more this year. You can imagine if every single early action student submitted first quarter grades, they simply would not be able to process all that information. Next question. Is it okay to apply early action to all the schools on my list? Yes, unless you are applying to a restrictive early action program or a single choice early action program like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Stanford. For the most part, though, a student could apply early decision and then as many non-restrictive early action programs as they want. And it does definitely create a lot more work, especially in the weeks leading up to the deadlines. Again, most of those early action deadlines are going to be November 1st, and most of those colleges are going to have additional essays. But if you have the time, I absolutely would encourage you to apply early action. Now, some people strategize and say that there are a lot of high achieving students applying to those institutions in the early action round and that they're better off applying in regular decision. I would say, you know, it's going to be tough in those early action pools. Almost always, those early action institutions, if it's a non-restricted program, it's going to be a very big applicant pool, whether you apply early action or regular decision. If you are a senior whose grades maybe went down during the pandemic and you're hoping to show improvement senior year, a lot of experts will say maybe apply regular decision so that they will see at least your first semester of grades. It's my opinion though, if possible, if you are applying to some of those schools regular decision, you absolutely should be applying to at least a couple of those rolling admissions programs, because those rolling admissions programs will allow you to submit an application sometimes as early as August or September. Much better chance of admission that early on in the admission cycle, and it's very important to gather a couple of college acceptances before winter break occurs. Hi, Matal. Do admissions officers read all 10 activities? Is an entire application read by the same admissions officer, or is it split between different admissions officers? Okay, if we could just hold this question just because there's two of them. Do admissions officers read all 10 activities? They do, but as I often say, Matal, you've heard me say this, they read them very quickly. Admissions officers are speed readers. So in Application Nation, when I'm reviewing a student's activity listing, I want everything to be super clear because that admissions officer is going to be reading through that list very fast, and you want everything to be clear. So using a lot of abbreviations is going to make it very difficult for that admissions officer to understand things. You don't want it to be complicated or convoluted. You want everything straightforward. But yes, they will read all 10 activities. But I always tell you all, make sure you're putting the most meaningful activities at the top of your list, because those are going to matter more for you and for the admissions officer. And usually those ones at the top of the list are going to have more hours per week, more weeks per year, possibly more leadership, and definitely probably a lot more impact. Second question, do the admissions officers split up the application, or is it read by one admissions officer? That's going to vary from admissions office to admissions office. There was a Chronicle of Higher Education article that came out back in 2017. And it actually highlighted a number of highly selective colleges that had changed how they read and evaluated applications. And Penn, my old employer and alma mater, admitted to the fact that they're now reading applications in about 4 minutes, and they're splitting up the application between 2 readers. We don't know if that's still going on, but we know that a handful of colleges followed suit and followed that plan that Penn had. So one admissions, they were sitting side by side, and again, I don't know if this is still going on. I think that would be very difficult during a pandemic, but back in 2017, Penn admitted that 2 admissions officers are reading the application. 1 admissions officer is reading more of the objective information, and the other admissions officer is reading more of the subjective information. I'm going to be honest, that model is very difficult to sustain. And for the most part, you're going to find across all colleges and admissions offices, almost always it's going to be a primary admissions officer reading that application from beginning to end. There are obviously going to be other people, part of the admissions office, part of the college or university community, who could also be reading that application, but that main admissions officer, usually assigned by the region of where you attend high school, usually is going to have the most authority, knowledge, and power over that application. What about optional videos? Okay to skip? Yeah, most of them are optional videos, but you will find that at the University of Chicago, Washington University, and they're probably Brown University also has an optional video. It's a really short video. It's supposed to be usually around 2 minutes long. There might be a couple more colleges that have that, but not many. They're not looking for you to like hire Steven Spielberg to, shoot a video about yourself. It's supposed to be very authentic to the student, and it shouldn't cost the student any money. I've seen a variety in terms of quality. I know one of our Application Nation class of 2021 students did the video for Brown, and he did such an amazing job. He did it himself, but it really represented every aspect of his soundbite. And the video was incredibly powerful for Brown. He got into Brown, he got in, I think, almost everywhere, maybe except one of the Ivies, but he's at Stanford now. So shout out to Wyatt. He did a great job on the video. So do I think it's necessary? I don't think it's necessary. I would only do it if the student feels really comfortable on camera and is going to be very clever. You don't just want to be sitting at your desk and mentioning things that are already in your application. You really want to make a big impact with a short amount of time. Do you think that colleges will be looking at grades during COVID differently than if everything had been in person, status quo to prior years? That's the hope, right? And colleges have statements on their admissions offices. If you go to the Harvard website, admissions website, you will see that they make a comment about this. But the truth is that when push comes to shove and you're dealing with especially a highly selective college, as much as they say they're going to be understanding, I think if they have a student who still has really strong grades despite the pandemic, I think that student is still going to have an edge over a student whose grades were impacted. That being said, if a student's grades have been impacted by the pandemic or something else, there is a section in the application called additional information. One is a more general additional information section box, and one is specific to COVID. So if you've been negatively impacted, your grades have been impacted, your safety, your health, your family, you would want to use that box to explain. And I think some colleges are probably going to be more understanding than others. And I would say colleges that have higher acceptance rates are probably going to be a lot more understanding than those colleges with super low acceptance rates. All right. Hi, Lissa. Are there advantages such as possibly an easier path to admission when applying for summer semester? Yes, there are. So what you'll find, and these are like hidden things that you uncover as you go through this process, what you find is that there are going to be some colleges and universities that have what I call alternate start dates. So for those larger public universities, you will often find that there is a summer option, meaning that the student would begin on campus the summer before freshman year. I know that Penn State has this for main campus, and I know a lot of the large public universities have this as well. If you list that you are willing to start or be considered for summer start for these public universities, it absolutely can increase your chances of admission. And I think it is a phenomenal opportunity to get on campus, get your bearings, take a couple of classes before everybody returns in the fall. So I think it's a really great idea. The other alternate start dates could be, for example, I worked at Franklin and Marshall College, and we admitted a cohort of freshmen that started spring semester on campus. And that meant that most of those students went abroad for fall semester. They were taking college classes that were already approved so that they could still graduate on time. Again, if you listed that you would be willing to be considered for spring semester at all these colleges, yes, it can increase your chances of admission. And that's the thing, if you want to go to that college that badly, I think most students are willing to start earlier or a little bit later depending on the plan that the school offers. So look into that. Not all colleges have that, but you're gonna find a lot of summer starts for those public universities and spring semester starting on campus for a lot of those private colleges and universities. An aid question, can you negotiate aid with schools like F&M that don't have merit scholarships if you have competitive offers? Okay, so you're right, Franklin and Marshall is a college that only offers need-based aid. So if you get a great merit scholarship from Lafayette or Gettysburg or Dickinson, but you really want to go to F&M and you want to negotiate, you don't have as much leverage because F&M does not offer merit scholarships. So if Lafayette and Dickinson and Gettysburg gave you merit scholarships, F&M can't really help you in terms of the merit scholarships. They don't offer it to anyone. However, there is room to negotiate when you're looking at peer-to-peer institutions and they have very similar policies for financial aid. So let's say you get admitted to Franklin and Marshall, you get your aid package, but you got a better need-based financial aid from Haverford College. You could take the offer from Haverford College and show it to the financial aid office at Franklin and Marshall so that they see how Haverford put together your need-based offer. And hopefully they can at least come in line. But again, you are better off when you're comparing apples to apples. So need-based financial aid at two institutions, or merit scholarship. And the other thing is, even if you see those two institutions or more than two institutions as true competitors and true peers, the institution where you're trying to get more money has to see that other institution that gave you more money as a true competitor and peer. And that's when you have the most leverage. But all these institutions, they're not going to tell you that they negotiate financial aid or they negotiate merit scholarships. They don't want that getting out. Do they do it? Yes, especially when it comes to merit scholarships. If I submit my application separately to individual colleges, can I add self-reported ACT scores to some schools and delete for others, or would all colleges have the ability to go back and see my scores on Common App? This is a great question, Cindy, especially because we've got so many students who are considering test optional policies, maybe for some of the colleges on their list, but not all. So what I tell students to do is you want to look over your application from start to finish before you submit it. Because let's say you are submitting your test scores to Villanova, for example. You can submit your application through Common App to Villanova. But let's say the next college that you're applying to, maybe it is Stanford. You do not want Stanford to get those scores. You could go back into the testing section and delete those scores, and Stanford would not get those test scores. And the scores to Villanova would not be changed because that has already been submitted. So yes, you can make changes to Common App, just be really, really careful. I always tell students to make sure that they review everything in the preview mode and have a parent or a mentor or an adult looking over their shoulder or reviewing everything to make sure that everything is accurate. Because if you're sending your test scores to some colleges but not others, you just want to make sure that somebody doesn't get your scores that shouldn't be getting them. If SAT score is optional and your score is less than desirable, but your GPA high school, should you send the score? I don't believe you should. So you determine if your SAT or ACT score is desirable based on looking at that college's most recent freshman profile. So I usually find that on the college's website. So you need to make sure, because your scores, you might not like them, you might not think that they're desirable, but maybe those scores do fit well within that middle 50% range of admitted students. But if the transcript is really strong, the student is taking the most challenging curriculum, they have really strong grades, but their test scores are a little bit lower or a lot lower, if you submit those test scores, it's just gonna bring down the entire application. Whereas if you just had your high school transcript and it's really strong and you didn't submit those lower scores, you would be a really strong applicant as long as your curriculum grades and everything else in your application matches up. So applying test optional is not a disadvantage at all. And then I always get the question, well, if you have high test scores, does that not even matter anymore? It totally matters, guys. I wish I was in that situation. I wish I was a naturally strong test taker, but I wasn't. But if you are, yeah, absolutely. You should be applying to colleges that will consider those SAT and ACT scores. So it's almost every single college in the country. The UC system, the University of California system, and a couple of other colleges are test blind in the admissions process. So those high test scores aren't going to help you there. But any college that requires the SAT or ACT, or a college that has a test optional policy, they still want your high test scores. So don't be afraid to share them. Do selective colleges still look at National Merit Scholarship semifinalist or finalist status, even if they do not offer merit scholarships? They do, and you can list that you are a National Merit semifinalist in the honors section of your application. I would say that the colleges that don't sponsor the scholarship, they tend to be the more selective colleges, and so there are going to be a lot of National Merit semifinalists in their applicant pool, but you can totally list that as an honor. It will get recognized, but obviously you would need to know if that college is a sponsor. And there's a list on the National Merit Scholarship page of all the colleges and universities that sponsor the scholarship, so check that out. Would you recommend to include your SAT scores if the score was a 1260 to UC and START schools? I'm not sure what that is. So the UC system, as I just mentioned, they are test blind in the admissions process. However, on the application, there's still a testing section, and you can report those scores, but they are absolutely blocked from the admissions officers who are reading your application. They would only come into play if you've been admitted and decide to enroll. The UC campuses can use those scores for placement. So even if you report those test scores, they are going to not even be considered. They will not even be available to the admissions officer when they're reviewing your application. Do colleges look at weighted or unweighted GPAs? This is a good question. So for a lot of students, they attend a high school that have weighted classes. So a lot of times if they take AP, honors, or IB classes, they get extra points added on to their GPA. If you're applying to the more selective colleges, they want to see that you're taking these classes. But you will find that out of all the sections of an application, the admissions officer spends the most time on your high school transcript. And when you look at a transcript, there's never an individual weighted grade for a class. You might get an overall weighted GPA, maybe at the bottom of your transcript, but they're not going to, no high school is going to list your weighted individual grade for each class. So what admissions officers do is they're looking at the rigor of your curriculum, and they're looking at the grade side by side. They are not conflating the two. So I always try to make this really clear with my Application Nation families. It's not that the grades matter more than the rigor or the rigor matters more than the grades. They are looked at equally. So it's almost like an equation. Rigor of the curriculum plus grades equals what matters in the admissions process. But if you have a transcript that has a weighted GPA and an unweighted GPA, you can list either on Common App as long as you are indicating whether it's weighted or unweighted. There is a prompt for that or a field on that on Common Application. All right, next question. Well, colleges consider that due to COVID, many students were not able to do the extracurriculars they had planned. I think they will. What I will say, and this is what I've been encouraging some of my students, if they've had a really important activity that came to a screeching halt and they have not been able to pick it up since the pandemic hit, you can actually weave that into the description of the activity. And you can be clever with the words to say, I'm thinking of one of my students who is a tennis player, and her whole fall semester tennis season of junior year did not happen. So when she was putting together her list, part of her description was, I can't wait to be back on the courts because I missed an entire season because of COVID-19. So I would try to work it into the description of the activity. I wouldn't say you should be using your COVID section to explain that. It's usually pretty obvious, but my hope is even if some things came to a screeching halt or you weren't able to do an activity or an experience, that you filled that time with something else that was just as important to you. Overall, ACT score is in range for most schools. However, one section is noticeably lower than others. Is that looked at unfavorably, even though the overall score is in range? So for the ACT, there are 4 sections that make up your composite ACT score: English, reading, science, and math. But the colleges are going to be looking at your composite score, so all 4 scores averaged together, and they're also looking at those individual scores. I think they care the most about your composite score. But a highly selective college where the admissions officers are trained to be nitpicky, they will look even more carefully at those individual scores. You don't want that lowest individual score on the ACT to match up directly to your major choice, though. So for example, let's say a student is applying as a science major, a biology or chemistry or engineering major, and their lowest score by far was science and math. So just be aware of that. Most of the time, the admissions officer is looking at the composite score, but again, at those more selective colleges, they're going to be looking at every little detail, including the scores on the individual sections. All right, last question. Is there any indication if there will be test optional admissions for fall of 2023? I got this question on the discussion board of our Application Nation class of 2022 board just in the last 48 hours. It is my belief that test optional is not just a passing trend, that it's here to stay. I will say that not every college that adopted a temporary test optional policy is going to continue that after this year, but I would say you're going to be surprised at how many colleges adopt a full-fledged permanent test optional policy. Why? They get more applications. They get a more diverse applicant pool from more states in the country, more racial diversity, more socioeconomic diversity, and so it only benefits them to be a test optional institution because it's going to attract more students. And in the end, these colleges are focused on themselves as institutions. They're there, even though they're not a business, they really act like a business. So they want as many applications as possible. I'm here to say, we are here for the students, and that's why I do these Facebook Lives every single month. That's why I do Instagram Lives during Fridays during the month, depending on the week. That's why I write a weekly blog. That's why I have free resources, because I want to make sure that every student and family going through this process is knowledgeable, going in with eyes wide open, and I am your biggest advocate in the college admissions process. So on that note, it's great to see all of you tonight, a really good turnout. But I hope to see you back here again in November. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.